Thank you to everyone who's joining us, and thank you to our esteemed panelists. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event hosted by the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. My name, if we haven't met, is Ashley Jackson, and I'm co-director of the Center for the Study of Armed Groups at the Overseas Development Institute, which is an independent think tank in the UK. Just a little bit about Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, for those who don't know. CFA's mission is to provide independent analysis and to engage in campaigning, advocacy, policy work, and lobbying to improve understandings of Afghanistan's complex context and to propose new solutions. CFA is led by the Afghan diaspora in the UK and works to inspire change and progress in Afghanistan. And we have CFA's director and founder on the panel, Shabnam, who I'll introduce in more depth in a moment. But just to introduce our topic today, for those who've been watching the process around intra-Afghan negotiations, it has been a particularly tumultuous few weeks and months. The main stumbling block, are you guys hearing me, Shabnam and others? Can you hear me, or is the sound?
We can hear you. It's a little bit unsteady. The quality isn't
okay. Maybe I'll go slowly, but feel free to interrupt me if it becomes terrible. And perhaps after this, I will turn off my video to make sure it stays all right. So anyway, it's been a very tumultuous few months around intra-Afghan negotiations. The main stumbling block of late has been the prisoner release set out in the US Taliban deal agreed back in February. As of today, however, it looks like, are you still having, I'm just watching the comments, are you having trouble hearing me still?
Yeah.
Okay. Shabnam, do you possibly want to take over and give a little bit of an introduction while I maybe log off and log on?
Yeah, do you
so
want to
that people can actually hear me?
That's fine, yeah. You can go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Perfect. While Ashley comes back on, I think she was trying to introduce the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan briefly and the work that we do, which is to ensure that Afghanistan's case is fairly heard in Parliament, and that we continue to raise awareness of some of the important challenges that the country faces presently. Today's discussion will be focusing very much closely on the issue of women's rights and the role of women in the peace process, which has been quite a contentious and difficult journey for activists and politicians in the country. And we're very fortunate to have a distinguished set of panelists who have a high level of expertise on the subject to be able to provide us a very detailed analysis of what's happening on the ground, their understanding of where Afghanistan is going, particularly on the issue of women's rights, and whether women's rights and the women's roles are accurately being represented by the government of Afghanistan. We will try to ensure the sort of the structure of the discussions will be asking our guests to provide us 3 to 5 minutes of introductory remarks on just generally their understanding of the theme of today's subject, and from their experiences of working in Afghanistan and being involved in the peace process. And then we'll move on to some questions and answers that Ashley Jackson, who will be the moderator, will be asking of our panelists. And then hopefully we may be able to also get some questions from our audience. So Ashley can step back in when she's able to join us again. But in the meantime, can I invite Miss Habiba Sarabi to provide us her opening remarks?
Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I am very happy to be in this very important moment with this important panel. Thank you very much for the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, for you, Shabnam, John, and other friends, to make this opportunity to talk about the peace process, and especially the peace negotiation, which is very close. So before we had a discussion, privately discussion with Shukria John and Barakzai, that so that's why several times I talked with you that maybe I cannot take part with this discussion because it's supposed to go to Doha today, but we couldn't. So this is the situation, unfortunately, in Afghanistan. The peace process is always back and forth, and so it's a bumpy road. It's not easy to tackle with peace issue in Afghanistan. I have been working with the peace process since 2016, and as a head deputy chair for High Peace Council. But we worked with the civil society, with women's group, with different, and to get with different group of community to get their idea about the peace process. But still, it was not sufficient for the people, and especially the women's rights and women issue was on the top of agenda everywhere, from the north of the country up to the south, and from east to west, and then the center. So women were, they had their concern about the if the during the peace process or the peace talk, if the women's rights and the achievement of Afghan women or Afghan people can be demolished. So this is a big question. This is a big concern, and the people of Afghanistan have the right to ask us to keep asking that what we are doing in Doha or with Taliban anywhere. So it is not an easy task. It's very tough, and the idea from two sides is very different, very different. So one side, which is Taliban, they are very extremist. They don't believe to women's rights and human rights. From the other side, the Republic, that we believe to democracy, women's rights, and human rights. So you can imagine that how much it will be difficult and tough to talk with this sort of people. So we have to find some common common agenda or common issue to talk about that, and after that, going forward for the some detailed issue like women's rights and human rights and this sort of issue. So it will be very tough. So of course, on the inclusivity or the other part of the issue, I will discuss later. Maybe there will be some question I can talk about that. So I will stop here. Maybe the question will come and I will answer for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Habiba. Hopefully, I have a better connection now. I have to apologize for that. Okay, what a relief. I don't think it would be a panel event without somebody having problems. But just to say, I think that set us off very nicely to sort of set the scene in terms of all of the difficulties, as well as all of the work and preparation that's gone in so far. But belatedly, I should give you a bit of an introduction, and then introduce Shukria and allow her to give opening remarks. Habiba Sarabi, for those of you who don't know, is a hematologist, a politician, a reformer, and she's also been named to the Afghan government negotiating team. As governor of Bamiyan, she was the very first woman ever to be named a provincial governor in Afghanistan. And she also served as Minister of Women's Affairs in the very early days, as a candidate for vice president, and as a deputy to the Afghanistan High Peace Council, among many other prestigious positions. Shukria Barakzai, our next panelist, is a politician, a journalist, a feminist, a diplomat, and a prominent voice for peace. She was a member of the 2003 Loya Jirga. She was a long-standing elected member of parliament, and most recently she was Afghanistan's ambassador to my new home country, Norway. And with that, Shukria.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you and good evening to my friends from Kabul. I hope, let's say, we will keep hope for peace, where I understand it will be a very difficult journey, especially for women and people of Afghanistan. Since politics are not following to take care of achievement, what the nation and public made, but I do believe peace is priority. When it comes about the women's role and issue with the peace process, with the respect to all participants, still I believe it's a very symbolic because under their skin, none of people in the government or in Taliban, they don't believe, they don't trust and the lack of political will is quite visible regarding the human rights issue or women's rights issue. That's very clear for I believe for even for members of the group. But symbolically, we do have a few women. Although if I go and compare the number of women to the men, and especially while they are talking and sitting around the table with Taliban, it's really uncomparable. When it comes to the, let's say, democratic values, Afghan constitutions, those values which is Afghans made in the past 9/11, to be honest, it is on the table of the negotiation, and it's a big fear that Afghan people shouldn't be the loser, but there is a strong fear because none of the parties are not committed. Usually they are just thinking what is their political benefit, what is the profit. But by complaining, I believe we may achieve anything. So it's better for us as a women in Afghanistan and other people such as like you, Ashley, like Shabnam, Jonet, organizations, international, other organizations, women's political leaders globally. If we can make a joint force to stand somehow with the red line, that those lines wouldn't be crossed either by government or by Taliban. Because at the end of the day, everything is in the hand of politicians, and those politicians must keep satisfied their donors. So that's the time I believe the civil society, those countries was leading by women, and women's rights activists should stand beside of Afghan women. And it's the time that we should keep the women voice loud, not only being loud, but meaningful loud. Like what is exactly we want? Nothing except having equal rights, plus equal rights between men and women with a guarantee. And we would like the peace process should be monitored and observed by an international third-party group. Otherwise, if they let intra-Afghan peace talks among the Afghan, I'm sure that locomotive will never find the right destiny.
I think you're on mute, Ashley.
Thank you, Shukria. That was a powerful warning for all of us about how to move forward and what might stand in the way. With that, I will go to Shabnam, who of course is the founder and director of Conservative Friends Afghanistan, and she's a British Afghan who came here at the age of 8 with her family, fleeing the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. She's been a tireless activist and campaigner and has played a prominent role in encouraging political engagement among the Afghan diaspora in the UK. Shabnam? I think you're on mute now.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley, for first of all moderating today's timely discussion, and thank you to our distinguished panelists for joining us. I'm extremely pleased that we have been able to hold this discussion days in advance of the negotiation team going forward to Doha. to start the talks. I guess the ongoing peace process in Afghanistan is threatening progress achieved over the last two decades on girls' and women's rights. And I share the sentiments of both Sarabi and Barakzai. All talks between the government and the Taliban have raised hopes for peace in the country. And how sadly, though, I think women fear another and related possibility, that their hard-won rights to participate in the nation's political and economic life could again be washed away by the Taliban's rigid view on gender. Afghanistan has been seeking peace for decades, and I guess it is time to embrace a new possibility of bringing an end to this ongoing conflict. But I think we need to also embrace the fresh perspective that women can bring. Afghans have already seen the benefit of having all of society, both men and women, contribute to the country's progress. Women's economic, social, and political contributions are strengthening the country's daily societal fabric and helping to build a more stable society as well. Women now constitute almost 20% of the labor force, from parliament to orchestras to civil society organizations to sport teams. Women are now on the national stage more than ever. And I guess the question that most have is whether women's contribution to peace processes are valuable. And from what we've seen in Afghanistan time and time again, it is. The evidence also proves very clearly, this has been proved in Philippines, in Liberia, in Northern Ireland, and many other regions, that women have had a substantive voice in peace processes. And so I strongly believe that women's inclusion in Afghanistan will be similarly impactful, since peace talks that substantively include women have been shown to be more likely to both succeed and last. The reality is that peace cannot be established by an agreement just between those who hold the weapons. And women are continuously sidelined because they are less often perpetrators of violence. But women cannot just be an issue in these negotiations. They must be a party to them, especially as they are the main victims and have been the main victims of this 20-year conflict, but also when the Taliban were in power pre-9/11. The chair of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission recently just expressed her concern that no woman is leading any structure of peace that has been created by the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And I think that worries a lot of people. We want to be able to have women who can actively represent the women in Afghanistan, have a say, and not be in positions simply for symbolic reasons. So there is a lot of optimism for the next steps, for the way ahead. And I do hope that women's gains will be preserved in the country, that any political settlement won't allow for any of the achievements that women have had in the country to be taken over. And with the contribution of women like our distinguished panelists today, I would very much stress that the importance here is ensuring that women have a very, very vocal voice, and that institutions such as the Ministry of Women's Affairs and the Women's Chamber of Commerce, the Human Rights Commission, all of these are preserved, and that they include women going forward. We need mechanisms in place and institutions in place that advocate for women's rights. Since the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan in the late 1970s, numerous attempts by neighboring and regional powers and the UN have been to forge a durable peace have failed. And I guess the lack of inclusion in those efforts of women have led to those outcomes. So, if an end to the conflict is a genuine goal of all the parties and their backers, I hope that they will continue to respond to women's demands and place women at the center and not the margin of these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabnam. Those were expansive remarks covering a lot of the ground I think we'll delve deeper into today. In particular, the global evidence you cite, the gains of having women, just in terms of utility, participate, that peace agreements last longer, that you have more buy-in, all of these things I think are incredibly important to highlight just on the base of common sense. But with that, I'll turn to Heather Barr for her opening remarks. Heather is currently the interim co-director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. She's focused on child marriage, violence against women, trafficking, and girls' education. She joined Human Rights Watch in 2011, originally as the Afghanistan researcher based in Kabul, following positions with the UN in Afghanistan and Burundi. Heather?
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, it's such a pleasure and such an honor to be part of a panel of such powerful and brave women. So thanks so much for inviting me to be with you this evening. I wanted to talk about how much of a struggle it's been for women to be part of this peace process, and how it should not have been and should not be this much of a struggle. Women have had to fight for every inch of their involvement in this process, and I've had the privilege of watching that fight for a lot of years now. As others have already said, neither the Ghani government nor the Karzai government have really fully accepted the right that women have. It's an actual right to be full participants in any peace process under United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. And I'm sad to say that the foreign countries that have been donors and troop contributors in Afghanistan have not stood up for this right enough either. There are a few countries that have really made women's participation in the peace process an important goal in their involvement in Afghanistan, but many more, including the most powerful country, which is the one that I'm from, the United States, have been really almost completely unwilling to expend political capital on insisting that women have to be part of this process, in spite of everything we know that Shabnam's talked about how having women involved is more likely to lead to a deal, more likely to lead to successful implementation of the deal, and so on. So we see that countries, the US and other countries, have been willing to write checks to pay for services for women in Afghanistan, although those checks are now disappearing as well. But when the ambassador goes to have a meeting with Ghani or Karzai, he, and it's almost always a he, never has women's rights and women's participation in the peace process on the list of issues that they want to talk about that day. So Afghan women have had to fight this battle largely on their own, and they have done every step of the way. And they know that this fight is essential because they know, as Shukria said, that women's rights are on the table in this negotiation. There's no question about that. And they know that if the door closes on the room where the negotiation is going to happen, and the only people in that room are men from the Taliban and men from the Afghan government, then there's nobody in that room who actually cares about women's rights. So my organization has spent a lot of time documenting the Taliban's extreme abuses against women. And we have a new report which says that the Taliban's extreme misogyny is pretty much intact. It hasn't changed very much since the bad old days. The changes have been changes of tone and degree, but not fundamental. I'm not comparing the Afghan government to the Taliban at all. Obviously, it's completely different, but we've also documented ways that the Afghan government has failed women's rights over and over and over again. From Farkunda's killers going free, to the huge inequities in the education system, to the failure to implement the EVA law, failure to abolish virginity examinations, failure to reform discriminatory personal status laws, failure to end moral crimes prosecutions. I could go on. I'll stop. But anyway, so Afghan women have been fighting for these rights, for all of their rights, but including the right to be part of the peace process. And they've been doing so ferociously and strategically and consistently for years, but they should have had much more support, and they should have much more support right now. Every ambassador in Kabul should be raising Security Council Resolution 1325 at every meeting they have with the Afghan government. Every country and every institution that's facilitating any part of this peace process should be asking constantly, where are the women? And full participation doesn't mean a small number of women get to be in the room. Full participation is actually 50%. And it's 50% at the leadership level as well, because women have suffered at least 50% of the harm in the decades of war that have happened in Afghanistan. And if Afghanistan's gonna have a brighter future, then women and girls are gonna have to do at least 50% of the work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Heather. Before I turn to Muqaddasa, I just wanted to say I think that's a very important point we should revisit on representation. Of course, the negotiating team is roughly a quarter female, far below your demand of 50%, right? And of the proportional representation to population. But among the High Council for Reconciliation, the names of which were announced earlier this week and seem to be disputed, there were only 8 out of 46 members that were female. And so, as you say, even on the government side, there's a lot of resistance, it seems, around actually delivering on the commitments that have been made. But with that, I should turn to Muqaddasa, who has just joined us, to give some opening remarks on where she thinks the state of women's participation is and what she would like to see. Muqaddasa is currently the country director for Lapis, which is a strategic communications firm, part of the MOBI group. She is also an adjunct lecturer for the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul. And she previously served in the Afghan government as Deputy Minister for Commerce and Industry. Muqaddasa, can I turn to you?
Thank you, Ashley. I'm honored to be here at the presence of remarkable women such as Dr. Sarabi and Ambassador Barakzai. I think for me it's important to acknowledge, I usually say this, but it's not to try to flag that I come from a different generation, but I think it's equally important for my generation to take an acknowledgement of the path that women before us have walked and have tried to pave it for us. So I usually, in my intervention, when I'm at the presence of Dr. Sarabi and people like Ambassador Barakzai, I'm a little hesitant to talk because I'm just not sure it's very intimidating to be at their presence. But I'd like to give this my best. I'd like to start by saying that I have noticed that a couple of people raised the question that why this is an all-woman panel. And honestly speaking, a month or 2 ago, I and another friend co-authored an article, it was in Farsi language here for one of our local media outlets, that actually particularly focused on this dimension of how the woman participation agenda has been pretty much marginalized to women themselves, and there's not much communication happening between our male counterparts. So I think for those of our colleagues who have raised questions here, I do acknowledge that. And sometimes, honestly, I do feel torn when I get these invitations where I have to be on an all-woman panel, because I understand that it's important that we have this conversation with our male counterparts. And some of the meetings that I have happened to be with members of the negotiation team, I have stressed a lot the fact and the need to build strategic alliances between the negotiation team, particularly between our female negotiators and our male negotiators. With that, I would like to zoom out a little, just to talk a little on the broader issues, because I feel like Afghanistan currently stands at a cross point of competing visions for a political trajectory that is not only a matter of fundamental rights and freedom for women, but it's actually a matter of fundamental rights and freedom for all Afghan citizens, and as well as a matter of geopolitical balancing of global security and stability. I always like to do this because I have noticed that when you try to narrow down the issue of women, then what happens is that people just think, you know, it's an extra agenda, probably not important. Let's focus on the bigger things. But I think it's worth reminding everyone in Afghanistan, including our male counterparts, that they didn't really enjoy their fundamental rights or basic human rights during the Taliban regime. So we should not forget that fact. It's not only about rights of women, but it's right of everyone in general. And with that, I think it's also worth mentioning that Afghanistan has never come this close to a possible end of the war. So where we stand today in terms of a future political trajectory, and most of the time people juxtapose it in form of an emirate and republic, I think it's again, I cannot underscore enough that in both of those potential future scenarios of governance for Afghanistan, it's important that we remember that fundamental rights and freedoms of all Afghans are actually at stake. Also, the need for urgency is great, and I think I'm happy that hopefully tomorrow, I'm not sure Dr. Sarabi would be able to confirm that, but hopefully tomorrow I heard that the team might be going to Doha. So I think it's important that we acknowledge the need for urgency, both because of the increasing level of violence and also not to allow space for regional spoilers. I do have I probably have a little bit of too much focus on regional dimension of the talks, and that comes from my engagement with the Ministry of Commerce, where I led this regional trade portfolio mainly, and where I could see that there's a lot of leverage, economic leverage, I would say, and leverage from an investment perspective that would help us to bring some of our regional partners on the table. And I also feel that it's worth mentioning that there is space for regional spoilers, and we all have been witnessing that. So I think in my interventions, I have been focusing a lot on trying to see that how regional stability or regional consensus for a democratic Afghanistan benefits everyone. Because when you talk of a democratic Afghanistan, then that sort of like includes all your basic principles of democratic governance, where every man, woman, and children could enjoy equal rights. I would leave it at that, Ashley. I don't want to go in details, but probably I'm pretty sure there are going to be questions on my understanding of role of women. But I just would like to again emphasize that at one point I did feel that there was too much conversation around protection of women's rights that in turn could also be counterproductive, because when you're emphasizing too much on protection, that basically means that your current gain are very vulnerable and you're afraid of losing them. So I'm always worried of how much you put emphasis on protecting women and also trying to portray a victim image of them, because I think at times that could also be counterproductive. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Muqaddasa. That was a number of great points. I think you make a very valid point in terms of the need to pay attention to women's rights, of course, as the other panelists have talked about, but also framing them in a way in which you can cultivate allies, and that women's rights are not just one issue, they're part of a broader issue around human rights, around democracy, around the future of Afghanistan and its society, right? And so while having discussions that are only women around these topics can risk ghettoizing them, and in the list of participants in the Reconciliation Council, that right, there was this category of just women. There were other political leaders, civil society leaders, they were all men. But that's the last thing you want to see, is women boxed in and used sort of to check a box. So hopefully we can delve into some of the issues around how to make this more about inclusivity without losing the core concerns. But what I'd like to do, and I'd encourage our audience to submit questions in the Zoom bar so we can have a little bit of inclusivity ourselves. But right now I'm going to turn to Habiba Sarabi to ask her a bit about something she probably cannot even tell us about, but I'll leave that up to her. You know, news did break today that perhaps tomorrow the negotiating team would be leaving for Doha, or if not tomorrow, quite soon. And so I wanted to ask you, Habiba, about what you would like to see in the design, the procedure, the agenda for talks, the way that talks are conducted to ensure that they are inclusive, that they do highlight issues of women's rights, human rights, and that those don't get lost in the broader issues that of course need to be resolved in talks.
First of all, about this, for the out of 21 members of the negotiating team, we are 4. Of course, 4 according to the number, it's not sufficient even for the percentage that we women we are present in Afghanistan and different other level. It's not enough. But unfortunately, most of the time when the team set up or introduced the representative introduced from several category from the political party, political figure, and different people. Mostly they are nominating male member. This is the problem that the number of women are very, very few. So, but this few number, we are going 3 from Kabul, 3 of us. So the number is not sufficient. That we have to work somehow how to design that to be on the decision making. First of all, the design was set up that we have 4 working committee. For each committee, 4 of us, we have been divided in 4 committees, because to have our voice and to have to be on the decision that they are talking about that or making decision. So we have to be present on that. That's why we 4 women, we have been divided in 4 committees. So this is one technique or tactic. The next one is that we have to find or to make our allies among the other team member. Fortunately, we do have some other male member from the team that they are our allies, and they are talking about women's rights. So it's not something that we women should talk about women's rights. The whole team should talk about women's rights. So there are some people, maybe they don't like to talk a lot about women's rights, but within this 5 months that we had our regular meeting, we convinced them and we gave them a lot of proof that they have to talk about women's rights. So the next tactic is that when we go to Doha, we are not directly talk, or the first agenda will not be the women's rights. This is something, for example, ceasefire is something that men and women, children and adult and everyone can enjoy from ceasefire. Ceasefire is something that it's on the top of our agenda. So and after that, we will talk about the general things that, of course, the women's rights will be a part of that. For example, the service for the people, how the people can get access to the health service, how they can get access to education, why the children, girls' children and boys' children cannot go to school in the southern area or the area that it's under the control of Taliban. These are the topics that we are talking about that, and after that, of course, we can go to the detail of this sort of issue. So we cannot talk directly to the women's issue and this. So we can talk generally, and of course, on the general points, there will be something on the women issue. But of course, our commitment is that we will not. We don't want to lose the achievement that we have. For example, our young generation that Muqaddasa Jan said, that whom we proud of them, our young generation. They have different desire, they have different opinion, they have different, point of view. How we can ignore all the achievement that we have and our young generation got and benefited from this situation. So these are the things that we keep in our mind during the time that we are negotiating with Taliban.
Thank you, Habiba. That was a very comprehensive answer, and a good point about, women's issues aren't necessarily a separate bullet point. They're in all of these, whether it's talking about a reduction in violence or a ceasefire, whether it's talking about access to basic services. It runs through everything. And that's a very important way to think about it as well. But I'm looking at the questions coming through, and I encourage any other of our audience members to type them in. But we've had some questions around tactics, and I wanted to turn first to Shukria, and then maybe have contributions from the other panelists. But Shukria, in your opening remarks, you talked about tactics and strategy. You talked about bringing different actors together to agree on common positions, to present a united front, to make sure that there really was unity and strategy. And I want to ask you to speak a little bit more about that. But both Din Mohammed in the comments asked about tactics as well. Masuda Sultan asked about ways to cultivate male allies, of course. I mean, how do you see a strategy taking shape that would capitalize on civil society, on diaspora, on, pressuring ambassadors to do what they said they were actually going to do, and all of the things that Heather raised? I mean, how do you see a strategy coming together? What would be key tactics that you'd like to see happening as we move ahead with talks?
Thank you so much. There are some already plans, which was been made or strategy by Afghan Women Network, and that's all about more than 200 or probably near 400 women's organizations. It's also, there's a written strategy from the government side, but there's a lack of political commitment among our international allies. That's a little bit shaky, because the two other may not work with the third element, which is the involvement and the engagement of the international community. If we like or not, Afghan war was an Afghan intra-war, and the peace also is not just only Afghan peace talks. We all know the region, country, and big powers in the world are been engaged since almost more than 4 decades in all the entire political situation in Afghanistan. They support one for their own political interests and benefits, and they support another. So it's time comes first for Afghans. I think my focus since a couple of months is more, I like to give a kind of wake-up call for the people of Afghanistan, because we should take our own responsibility as well. As long as we are not responsible, no one else cannot make for us anything. I do appreciate the cooperation, the support, financial support, moral support, political support from the international community. But when it comes back to our own homework, I think that is the top priority. And the second more important issue, I believe, for the peace talks, allow me to say that although the quality of women are really important while they're around the table, but the strategy among them, I do appreciate that they are working technically with their own male counterpart, but to be honest, from my own experience during drafting the constitution, they are the most untrustable people, because at the end, they are men. At the end, their top priority is their top political interest. At the end, they want to have more power rather than anything else. So that's why it's very, very important for for everyone and the negotiation team and outside of that. To be aware about the different type of techniques which is Afghan men, despite of its Taliban or government, are using against. The very, I think, more important issue doesn't matter how much government and Taliban are putting women sideline or keeping them sideline, that much we are getting more. To be honest, we are strategizing our voice. We are collecting the opinions. We are feel more powerful than before because I believe the Afghan women voice is very loud now. It's not that we are very offensive. It's not that we are very um, let's say showing ourselves that we've been victim of war and we don't want to be victim for peace as well, but it's clear that we don't want injustice. Simple as that. I think the most important we can do at the moment, and which is it must be done as soon as possible, to bring internationally, I mean, somehow globally, and especially the, let's say, the flag keeper for peace in Afghanistan, United States of America. I don't want to say them to remember your messages to the Afghan public. We don't want you to win our heart and minds, but we'd like you to be stuck on what you were saying regarding war against terror, regarding democracy, about human rights. I don't want to say what is their internal politics. I don't want to deep down there, but I do understand temporary peace would may not be a success story, neither for a European country which they help and support Afghanistan, and not for the United States of America. But it would be a very successful story for all the fanatics, Islamist groups, which is they are fighting not for Islam, but against Islam. What is very important for women? I think as long as you understand the situation of Afghan women, we can strategize more and we can cooperate better internationally and globally. And I believe the organizations should put their effort together for a better result. Although there's some promises regarding the future funding project, if Taliban didn't accept, so the fund will be cut. But again, who will be punished? Again, it's people of Afghanistan. To be honest, my opinion is not that we are very close to the peace talk. I have a kind of, let's say, sense, which is we are very close in such an unstable situation that things are going to be out of control, politically, economically, and I could say security-wise. So it's a very difficult time. With the movements, with the zigzag road of peace, I'm not very optimistic how much Taliban were stacking their commitment, although there's no commitment from their side when it comes to the Afghanistan or Afghan people, and especially and particularly to the Afghan women. I really can't see any changes on their messages. But from the other side, and the government of Afghanistan also, day by day, they are trying to maneuver the issue of, let's say, a democracy, a value of democracy, those achievements, because they're politicizing everything to the interpretation of the republic. So because they're also thinking just for a couple of more years, they should be in power, and what will may happen next, they think they are not responsible for that one. But I think this is the most important, as long as we are united, as long as we are one united force, and we are making our politicians in different parts of the world to keep and struggle and put some red lines, uncrossable red lines. I think for the Afghan peace talk, it might work. If this thing goes in a box, I believe that peace process will be just paper exchange between two parties, which is none of them are believing democracy or women's rights. But despite of all situation, I believe Afghans in general, but especially Afghan women, and particularly Afghan new generation will stand, because their interpretation from their responsibility is much different from my generation. They understand what does it mean being in a let's say a little bit civilized country, or connected with the entire world.
Thank you. That was a very good point about the dangers of male allies, that they are still men at the end of the day. That said, I think it's a valid point that Mukaddesa was making about the need to try and bring them along. And she also highlighted the generational differences and the ways in which that can be an asset as well. As you were saying, Shukria, they have had the benefits since 2001. Not that it's all been rosy. Of course, it's been incredibly difficult on a lot of levels, but they see what they're about to lose. I wanted to possibly turn back to Mukaddesa to talk to her a little bit about something that Shukria touched on, that when there was this US deal dialogue in Doha, when that all started, you heard Afghan women's voices in the Afghan media and the regional media and the international media. You really had, I think, a striking response, and these loud voices, as Shukria was saying. If we still have Mukaddesa, yeah, we still have Mukaddesa. I wanted to ask you, you wrote a very powerful and widely read op-ed a year and a half ago with Miriam Safi in the New York Times about your concerns about what might be sacrificed. And I wonder if you thought anything had changed, and if so, what? I mean, do your concerns remain the same as they were then? Has anything been clarified? Has your position changed? What have you seen change in the time between then and now?
Thank you. That's a good question. It got me thinking. What has changed is actually the magnitude of determination and desperation, I would say, at the part of some major actors and stakeholders in the peace process to end this war at any cost. And I think and this was February 2019, and looking back, you almost feel like your concerns are not relevant anymore. So if I would write the same op-ed today, I think, as painful as it is that your concerns become irrelevant, but I think it's also a sombering dose of reality, to acknowledge that certain stakeholders in the process are just willing to compromise anything. And most of the time, it's actually our international stakeholders, unfortunately. So I think that is something that I would say has changed, and it's also very personal to me. Again, I say it's a little painful, but again, sombering dose of reality, I would say. Because back then we didn't think that we'll stand where we stand today, where a lot of flexibility has already been shown in terms of what is compromisable. What hasn't changed, I would say, is actually the fragmentation and the chaos, the political fragmentation, domestic fragmentation in our political elites. That is still the same. Back in February 2019, we had a lot of these issues that we actually currently are facing right now. And I think that's very alarming, because increasingly there's a pessimistic reality of what might a possible outcome be for us if the status quo remains the same, in terms of how politically fragmented we are domestically currently. And when you look at how the Taliban have been mobilizing themselves and even showing inflexibility in terms of their stance, which I think from a technical negotiation perspective, that's actually a win for them. Because if you remember, probably back in February 2019, a lot of people thought that Taliban are not gonna back off on reducing the level of violence or a potential ceasefire. but the fact that today Talibs have shown that level of inflexibility to compromise, I think it speaks to their ability to negotiate. And it also speaks to the level of inflexibility on the table actually speaks to their strong political consensus within them. And the fact that they are in a position to show that inflexibility, make those compromises and move ahead in the negotiation table is, I think it's something personally alarming for me. And I think the Afghan government and the negotiation team needs to take a stock of that. So that's something that I feel that it hasn't changed. And in terms of the progress, I would say, particularly when it comes to women issues, I mean, Ambassador Barakzai put it really well, the fact that probably Afghan women were the only segment of the society, you know, who successfully mobilized at a very large level. They came up with multiple statements, multiple gatherings, making sure that, you know, the basic red lines are at least known to people. They probably were the first faction of the society that created consensus amongst themselves, as much as they didn't necessarily have to, you know, because that in itself, I think demanding a lot of consensus in itself is a form of oppression, because in a political society, I think there should be competing ideas. So as much as putting all that pressure of bringing consensus among themselves, I feel is in a way a form of oppression, but I also acknowledge the fact that we are a vulnerable group and we are all by ourselves. So I think I've been very proud of how our fellow women have been mobilizing, have been putting their demands on the table. I'm very happy that looking back in February 2019, today we have 4 formidable women as part of our negotiation structure, and I think that is very important, and it's a great achievement. So I think in terms of progress, particularly on how women have mobilized, I would certainly recall those ones. Thank you, Ashley. I hope I've been able to answer all of it, because there were a couple of parts to it.
Yeah, I asked a complicated and very long question, but I think that, yeah, that's super interesting in part, you know, the things that you would change and what you wouldn't, or that have changed. I mean, political fragmentation part, I think, is an important part to keep in mind for watching talks as they go forward. Can any issue be adequately represented at the table if the side representing it isn't united, it has its own internal struggles? I mean, that, as someone who watches the Taliban, is my concern as well. As you said, the Taliban at least appears to be the more united side, which, like you, makes me very concerned, not only because it means all of these issues become a bit harder to negotiate and pressure them on. And so far they've gotten away very easily by saying that they welcome, you know, Islamic versions of education for women and all these kinds of things, but we really don't know what they are willing to commit to. Which brings us back to the more global picture of how different actors and organizations can work together to support Afghan women on these issues. And I'd like to turn to Shabnam to ask her a little bit about the UK perspective. What do you think that, I mean, this has 2 parts, which again, I should apologize for in advance, but what do you think both diaspora groups in the UK can or should be doing as talks move ahead and progress? And what do you also think the British government should be doing? It's made, like a lot of foreign governments involved in Afghanistan, it's made many commitments on women's rights, but I'm curious to hear whether or not you see their track record on the ground actually backing those commitments up.
Thank you, Ashley. Well, I think it's firstly important to thank British and international troops and their families for the sacrifices that they've made in Afghanistan. And I think it's even more so particularly difficult to release Taliban fighters who have killed both British forces and the people of Afghanistan in the last 20 years. Look, I think what the peace deal so far was predicated on a Taliban ceasefire. And although there has been fewer attacks on foreign soldiers, the Afghan government and activists have continued to be targeted. Just a couple of weeks back, Fawzia Koofi, a campaigner for female rights and a member of the negotiation team, was attacked as she drove into Kabul. She's now recovering from a bullet wound in her right arm. And, you know, they promised the ceasefire would be the first item on the agenda of the peace deal, but the Taliban have not embraced that ceasefire. So, you know, when it comes to women's rights, that this hasty negotiation seems to be a tactical victory for the Taliban. If they are not keeping their promises on key elements of the agreement, you know, how do we then ensure that they continue to keep promises on the wider picture? And I guess, you know, Afghanistan continues to face enormous challenges. You know, recent UN reports stated that Al-Qaeda was quietly gaining strength while continuing to operate with the Taliban under its protection. And I guess the key thing that we want from Britain and our international friends is for an orderly peace. I think without that, the future in Afghanistan could be bleak. We're at a critical juncture of either bringing stability to the country or, God forbid, a new cycle of violence. And when you look at the foreign policy aspect of this, the withdrawal of US and UK troops provides an opening for Russia and China to reassert its diplomatic presence in the country. And this prospect should concern policymakers. In addition to complicating the path to a lasting peace, Russia continues to spread disinformation about US, UK, and other international objectives in Afghanistan that is aimed at eroding Afghan public trust in the security guarantees that our British and American friends can give us. And I guess for Russia, the US and UK withdrawal will serve as a golden opportunity to reconfigure its position in Central Asia region and reassert itself in Afghanistan. And so, I mean, the war in Afghanistan has been the world's most lethal conflict, with almost 45,000 security forces killed since 2014 and more than 10,000 civilians killed last year. I mean, this makes Afghanistan the worst conflict in the world, and it's worse than Syria and Yemen. So we need to understand that anything that goes on in that country, in that region, directly impacts the security and the stability of the West and the security of our international friends as well. And so I hope that with the ongoing peace process talks and as it progresses, that our British friends ensure that you know, we're not left in the lurch on our own, dealing with the impacts of American withdrawal and a peace agreement that is quite vague at that. And when it comes to, you know, women's issues, in theory, Afghan women should have at least had an insurance policy against exclusion from any talks or power sharing arrangements, but that again hasn't been discussed or spoken of. And as Barakzai Sib and Sarabi Sib and Muqaddam Sajan has very clearly outlined, and as they are, you know, they're working on the ground, which we're incredibly proud of, to see women like them to be able to voice the authentic and the real challenges of Afghan women in Afghanistan. We want to ensure that I guess, stressing for what I've said earlier, that it's not symbolic in any way. You know, we're not, what we're asking for is not a seat at the table for the sake of having the seat at the table. We're asking for mechanisms and policies to be guaranteed that will protect women and protect the security of women in the country. And I guess hopefully once the talks do begin, I would urge that negotiators would firmly reject any backsliding on rights in Afghanistan's embedded in Afghanistan's constitution and legal code. Enforcement must be guaranteed for laws that bar violence against women and abolish any discriminatory and unjust practices and traditions. The agreement to reach a political settlement must honor Afghanistan's obligation to implement international laws and treaties to which Afghanistan is a party of. And I guess the pivotal outcome that we're all hoping for is that the agreement, whilst we're all concentrating on the talks at present, we need to ensure that we continue to have a vision of what we want Afghanistan to look like once these talks are over and once we come to a settlement. So keeping that in mind and continuing to have the support of our British friends, particularly as we're based in the UK, and that is where most of the work of the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan is centered at. That is what we want. And with the other diaspora groups, whether they're in the UK or around the world, it's providing that helping hand, providing that expertise, that knowledge, and hopefully also ensuring that Afghanistan offers opportunities for people to come back and to be able to share their experiences and their knowledge for the development of Afghanistan going forward. I think that's a real asset for the country. It has been over the last 20 years, and moving forward, it will be with the formation of a new government, a new Afghanistan that will hopefully have peace moving forward.
Thank you, Shabnam. I think that's a very good point about cultivating a vision for a shared future, but one that I think right now feels very far off. Before we wrap up, I'd like to turn one last time to Heather Barr to ask a similar question in a way. And I'm wondering what kinds of commitment and action you'd like to see come from the US. Shukria hinted at, I don't know how to put this diplomatically, but the US's internal turmoil at the moment. But certainly there's an election coming up. There's a lot of speculation about how that may or may not influence the US position towards Afghanistan and its role in intra-Afghan negotiations. So yeah, from your perspective, what would you like to see the US actually do that it hasn't been doing? And how do you think ongoing political dynamics and the election will potentially affect the US's position?
Thanks, Ashley. What would as others have said, I think it's worth remembering that the US has never been a consistently reliable partner to Afghan women. I talked earlier about how the US has spent a lot of money on services for women in Afghanistan, and that's been wonderful. It's supported, groups that have, helped grow a lot of the activists who are playing such an important role today. It's educated lots of girls. It's saved lives through providing healthcare for women, etc. But it's worth remembering also that there are many, many times that the US has let Afghan women down. Human Rights Watch wrote a report, which I think it came out in 2009, called "We Have the Promises of the World." I think perhaps some of our panelists actually were interviewed for that report. And it was people talking about how the international community, and particularly the US at that point, was already breaking a lot of its promises on women's rights. There's a newspaper article that I will never forget, which I think was from about 2012, where an unnamed person from the State Department talked about how they had been quietly taking out indicators on women's rights from a lot of USAID programming. And I see you smiling, Ashley. I think you remember the quote. The person said that all the pet rocks in their rucksack were weighing them down, which kind of encapsulates, I think, the ways in which women's rights have been useful to the US and not always sort of sincerely and fully embraced. I guess one of the really frustrating moments that I had in sort of my time as an Afghanistan watcher was seeing some people who I really thought should know better being very enthusiastic about what a Trump presidency might mean for Afghanistan, and not seeing sort of some of the danger signs that I think people should have seen early on if they knew more about him. I think we've seen that this U.S. government is not concerned, is making decisions about Afghanistan based entirely on U.S. domestic politics, and I think more specifically U.S. domestic electoral politics, with very little regard for how that's going to affect Afghans and people living in Afghanistan. I think the idea that this administration would be a brave defender of women's rights is laughable, honestly. I mean, my organization, where we're looking all around the world at damage that's being done by things like the global gag rule that's crushing access to women's reproductive health services and so on, that have been put in place by this government. But let's talk for a second about what a different US government might mean for this process, because that's not fantastic news either. It doesn't take much research to find a mention of Joe Biden shouting at Richard Holbrooke in 2010. He said, "I'm not sending my boy back there to risk his life on behalf of women's rights." Talking about Afghanistan. He said, "It just won't work. That's not what they're there for." And he's been pushing for a US scaling back of engagement in Afghanistan since 2008. And in February of this year, he was on Face the Nation telling an interviewer that he would feel he had zero responsibility, that was the quote, if US disengagement led to a rise of the Taliban and destruction or damage to women's rights. Kamala Harris, it would be wonderful to think of her as an ally. You know, she's a woman, she's of Asian origin. She made one visit to Afghanistan in 2018 and didn't really say very much. It was part of her sort of honing her foreign policy credentials for her run at president. So I think Ambassador Barakzai has talked about how you know, Afghans are kind of on their own and need to see themselves as forced to lead their own destiny. And I think that the US, given all of that history, given the crisis that's happening right now with the US being the world capital of the COVID epidemic, the violence that's happening around the demand for racial equality in the US is less interested in Afghanistan than it ever has been. And that's just going to be the reality going forward with either president.
Well, on that realistic but grim note, I will wrap things up. No, I think that's a very important point. And one of the points that strikes me about today is that we've talked about the risks and the potential in allies, being able to use them or pressure them, whether they be men or whether they be the US government, into supporting a certain agenda is incredibly risky and hard work, but necessary to the kind of tactics and strategy that I think women and human rights advocates, people who want to see Afghanistan be a democracy, will need to invest in very carefully and very calculatedly over the long term. But certainly with talks apparently set to finally move forward, it's more important than ever before that women's voices are heard and that they play more of a lead role in these future processes, and that people like myself and Heather and the people we've criticized today in various governments listen to them, or be forced to at least listen to them. So many, many thanks to all of our panelists and to Shabnam and CFA for organizing this today. I apologize for not getting to all of the questions in the Q&A. There were too many good ones and too little time, but thank you again to everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.